The Price of Temptation. A Story of Regret and Redemption. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Spark. Catherine was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. She exuded elegance, intelligence, and an air of quiet confidence that made her impossible to ignore. Married for 6 years to Daniel, a devoted and hard-working architect, her life seemed picture-perfect to those who glanced from the outside. But beneath the polished veneer of their marriage, Catherine felt restless. Daniel's long hours at work left her feeling neglected, and though she loved him, the spark that once defined their relationship had dimmed. Enter Adrian Blackwell, her boss. Adrian was everything Daniel wasn't: bold, charismatic, and always attentive. As the CEO of the marketing firm where Catherine worked, Adrian commanded every room he entered. He was married, too, a detail he seemed to wear lightly, as if it were an inconvenient accessory. Their professional relationship had always been cordial, but over time, stolen glances and lingering touches blurred the lines of propriety. One late evening at the office, the unspoken tension between them finally reached its breaking point. A celebratory drink after a major project turned into an intimate conversation. Words gave way to shared confessions of dissatisfaction in their respective marriages. The chemistry that had simmered beneath the surface ignited into an affair that both thrilled and haunted them. Chapter 2. A Web of Lies. Catherine quickly became adept at leading a double life. To Daniel, she was the same loving wife she'd always been, albeit slightly more distracted. Adrian, meanwhile, reveled in the thrill of having her. He began favoring her at work, assigning her to high-profile projects, praising her ideas in meetings, and even sending her small, thoughtful gifts under the guise of professional gratitude. But secrets are rarely sustainable. The first cracks appeared when Adrian's wife, Evelyn, noticed his sudden obsession with his phone. Her suspicions grew when she overheard a hushed conversation between Adrian and Catherine. Though she didn't have proof, Evelyn's intuition screamed betrayal. At the same time, Daniel began to sense that something was off. Catherine's late nights at the office and her sudden disinterest in their shared routines didn't go unnoticed. He tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed off his concerns with practiced ease, blaming stress at work. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The affair, intoxicating as it was, began to unravel under the weight of guilt and suspicion. Catherine found herself questioning her decisions. Adrian, once a source of excitement, now seemed reckless and possessive. Meanwhile, Evelyn hired a private investigator, determined to uncover the truth. Within weeks, the investigator provided her with damning evidence: photos of Adrian and Catherine leaving a hotel together. Armed with this knowledge, Evelyn confronted Adrian during a company gala, ensuring Catherine was present to witness the fallout. In a public spectacle of calculated fury, Evelyn revealed the affair to everyone within earshot, including Catherine's colleagues and, most painfully, Daniel. The humiliation was swift and unforgiving. Adrian's board demanded his resignation to protect the company's reputation. Catherine, now ostracized by her peers, was forced to resign as well. But the worst came when she returned home to find Daniel packing his belongings. His face, a mask of heartbreak, said everything his words couldn't. Chapter 4. The Weight of Regret. Adrian, now estranged from his wife and children, found himself drowning in regret. The affair had cost him everything: his career, his marriage, and his reputation. He reached out to Catherine, but her own world was in shambles. Daniel had filed for divorce, and her attempts to explain or apologize fell on deaf ears. One evening, Catherine sat alone in her empty apartment, staring at the life she had destroyed. She realized that the affair hadn't been about love or passion. It had been an escape from problems she didn't have the courage to face. Adrian's charm had been a temporary balm, but it came at a devastating cost. Chapter 5. Redemption and Forgiveness. Months turned into years. Adrian, determined to rebuild his life, sought therapy to understand the choices that had led him down such a destructive path. He eventually started a nonprofit organization focused on helping professionals navigate workplace ethics and personal boundaries, a small attempt to atone for his mistakes. Catherine, too, embarked on a journey of self-discovery. She moved to a new city, started a modest consulting business, and committed herself to personal growth. Though she tried reaching out to Daniel several times, he had moved on, finding solace and stability in a new relationship. In time, Catherine learned to forgive herself, though the scars of her decisions remained a constant reminder of the cost of betrayal. A deeper dive, the ripple effect of betrayal. Adrian's perspective, the allure of power and the price of pride. Adrian Blackwell, with his sharp mind and undeniable charisma, had always been a man of ambition. He thrived on power, both in the boardroom and in his personal life. As the CEO of a growing company, he had achieved the pinnacle of success, yet he found himself continuously hungry for more. But his hunger wasn't solely for wealth or status. It was for validation, for control, for a sense of dominance over the world around him. It wasn't until Catherine entered his life that he realized just how deep his thirst for validation ran. Catherine wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, capable, and above all, she admired him. In her, Adrian found someone who looked at him not as a boss, but as a man, someone who could see the cracks in his polished exterior and still find him compelling. She became a mirror of his own desires and flaws. But what began as a harmless flirtation quickly morphed into a dangerous obsession. Adrian, always the strategist, convinced himself that this affair wasn't about escaping his marriage, it was about conquering new territory. Catherine was the ultimate challenge, a way to prove to himself that he could have anything, that he was in control. But as he drew her deeper into his web, he failed to see the consequences of his actions. When Evelyn's confrontation came, it was as if the world had come crashing down. His carefully curated image as a successful businessman shattered in front of him. The humiliation was public, and the sting of being exposed for who he truly was, someone capable of such reckless, egotistical behavior, was a wound deeper than any physical injury. In the aftermath, Adrian spent countless nights contemplating the life he had built and lost. His marriage to Evelyn, once a partnership rooted in shared goals and love, was irrevocably damaged. But even worse was the loss of his professional legacy. The company he had poured his heart into crumbled, and his reputation, once untouchable, now carried the mark of scandal. Adrian eventually sought therapy, but not out of a desire to fix his past mistakes. He did it because he needed to understand why he had taken such a dangerous path, why the allure of a temporary escape had been so irresistible. His sessions unearthed painful truths, his deep-seated insecurity, the emptiness he tried to fill, with power and the way he had commodified relationships, starting with Catherine. He hadn't just betrayed his wife and his company, he had betrayed himself. But through therapy, Adrian began to understand that redemption wasn't a matter of fixing what had been broken. It was about changing the person who had made those choices. His nonprofit, aimed at teaching professionals about ethics and personal boundaries, wasn't just about atoning for the affair. It was about transforming his legacy, no longer defined by his past transgressions, but by his commitment to preventing others from making the same mistakes. Catherine's perspective. From temptation to self-discovery. Catherine's journey was less about redemption and more about self-discovery. For her, the affair with Adrian wasn't driven by love or even lust. It was a desperate attempt to feel alive again. In her marriage to Daniel, she had lost a part of herself. The passion they once shared had been replaced with routine, and in Adrian, she found a fleeting escape, an exciting distraction from the monotony of her life. But once the affair spiraled out of control, the reality of what she had done hit her like a ton of bricks. When Evelyn confronted Adrian, Catherine had already begun to feel the weight of her actions. The moment she saw Daniel's face, broken, betrayed, and devastated, she realized just how much she had lost. She could no longer pretend that this affair had been a simple mistake. It had shattered her marriage, destroyed her reputation, and left her feeling hollow. In the aftermath, Catherine moved away, cutting herself off from the chaos she had created. She threw herself into rebuilding her career, but this time, it wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder or impressing anyone. It was about rediscovering her own identity, an identity that had been obscured by her marriage, her job, and most painfully, by the affair with Adrian. It wasn't easy. The loneliness was suffocating at times. But in that solitude, Catherine began to understand the deeper layers of her own psyche. She realized that the affair with Adrian had been a symptom of a larger problem. She had been looking for validation from others because she had never truly validated herself. She had spent her life trying to live up to others' expectations, first as a wife, then as a colleague, and finally as a lover. But now, alone in her new city, she could hear her own voice for the first time. A deeper dive, the ripple effect of betrayal. Adrian's perspective, the allure of power and the price of pride. Adrian Blackwell, with his sharp mind and undeniable charisma, had always been a man of ambition. He thrived on power, both in the boardroom and in his personal life. As the CEO of a growing company, he had achieved the pinnacle of success, yet he found himself continuously hungry for more. But his hunger wasn't solely for wealth or status. It was for validation, for control, for a sense of dominance over the world around him. It wasn't until Catherine entered his life that he realized just how deep his thirst for validation ran. Catherine wasn't just beautiful. She was intelligent, capable, and above all, she admired him. In her, Adrian found someone who looked at him not as a boss, but as a man, someone who could see the cracks in his polished exterior and still find him compelling. She became a mirror of his own desires and flaws. But what began as a harmless flirtation quickly morphed into a dangerous obsession. Adrian, always the strategist, convinced himself that this affair wasn't about escaping his marriage, it was about conquering new territory. Catherine was the ultimate challenge, a way to prove to himself that he could have anything, that he was in control. But as he drew her deeper into his web, he failed to see the consequences of his actions. When Evelyn's confrontation came, it was as if the world had come crashing down. His carefully curated image as a successful businessman shattered in front of him. The humiliation was public, and the sting of being exposed for who he truly was, someone capable of such reckless, egotistical behavior, was a wound deeper than any physical injury. In the aftermath, Adrian spent countless nights contemplating the life he had built and lost. His marriage to Evelyn, once a partnership rooted in shared goals and love, was irrevocably damaged. But even worse was the loss of his professional legacy. The company he had poured his heart into crumbled, and his reputation, once untouchable, now carried the mark of scandal. Adrian eventually sought therapy, but not out of a desire to fix his past mistakes. He did it because he needed to understand why he had taken such a dangerous path, why the allure of a temporary escape had been so irresistible. His sessions unearthed painful truths, his deep-seated insecurity, the emptiness he tried to fill, with power and the way he had commodified relationships, starting with Catherine. He hadn't just betrayed his wife and his company, he had betrayed himself. But through therapy, Adrian began to understand that redemption wasn't a matter of fixing what had been broken. It was about changing the person who had made those choices. His nonprofit, aimed at teaching professionals about ethics and personal boundaries, wasn't just about atoning for the affair. It was about transforming his legacy, no longer defined by his past transgressions, but by his commitment to preventing others from making the same mistakes. Catherine's perspective. From temptation to self-discovery. Catherine's journey was less about redemption and more about self-discovery. For her, the affair with Adrian wasn't driven by love or even lust. It was a desperate attempt to feel alive again. In her marriage to Daniel, she had lost a part of herself. The passion they once shared had been replaced with routine, and in Adrian, she found a fleeting escape, an exciting distraction from the monotony of her life. But once the affair spiraled out of control, the reality of what she had done hit her like a ton of bricks. When Evelyn confronted Adrian, Catherine had already begun to feel the weight of her actions. The moment she saw Daniel's face, broken, betrayed, and devastated, she realized just how much she had lost. She could no longer pretend that this affair had been a simple mistake. It had shattered her marriage, destroyed her reputation, and left her feeling hollow. In the aftermath, Catherine moved away, cutting herself off from the chaos she had created. She threw herself into rebuilding her career, but this time, it wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder or impressing anyone. It was about rediscovering her own identity, an identity that had been obscured by her marriage, her job, and most painfully, by the affair with Adrian. It wasn't easy. The loneliness was suffocating at times. But in that solitude, Catherine began to understand the deeper layers of her own psyche. She realized that the affair with Adrian had been a symptom of a larger problem. She had been looking for validation from others because she had never truly validated herself. She had spent her life trying to live up to others' expectations, first as a wife, then as a colleague, and finally as a lover. But now, alone in her new city, she could hear her own voice for the first time. The Deepening Journey, a tale of self-discovery and transformation. Chapter 1. The unseen struggles of Adrian Blackwell, now removed from the trappings of his former life, faced the profound loneliness of his choices. Once the epitome of corporate success, he was now a shadow of the man he used to be. His company, once a monument to his ambition, no longer existed. His family, his wife, Evelyn, and children, had moved on without him, and the guilt of what he had done loomed like a heavy cloud over him. Adrian's new nonprofit, though initially motivated by a desire to redeem himself, became something more. It was through this work that he began to glimpse the facets of his soul he had long neglected. His work in ethics and personal boundaries opened his eyes to the profound connection between self-awareness and integrity. It wasn't enough to simply do good by helping others avoid his mistakes. He had to confront the root causes of his behavior, his need for control, his fear of vulnerability, and his unwillingness to face his true self. The nonprofit work gave him purpose, but it was only through deeply personal reflection that Adrian began to truly understand his actions. In therapy, Adrian wrestled with the idea of forgiveness. He found it easier to forgive himself for his professional failures, but much harder to absolve himself for the pain he had caused Evelyn and his children. He started journaling, writing about his childhood, his relationships, and his obsession with power. In those pages, Adrian found the raw truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding: his need for approval, his fear of being seen as weak, and his belief that success was the only way to prove his worth. Adrian's journey was slow, and the road to healing was not linear. There were moments when he would feel like he was finally making progress, only to have the weight of his past decisions drag him back. Yet each small realization brought him closer to a new version of himself. Through the nonprofit, he found a small community of like-minded individuals who, like him, had faltered along their own paths. Together, they supported one another in a quiet rebellion against their former selves. Chapter 2. Catherine's awakening. For Catherine, the journey was less about seeking external forgiveness and more about understanding who she truly was. After the affair, she felt as if she had lost her sense of self. Everything about her life had been defined by her roles: the devoted wife, the ambitious employee, the woman adored by others. Yet in those roles, she had neglected the most important relationship, the one with herself. Moving to a new city after her resignation, Catherine felt the weight of her own solitude. At first, the loneliness was unbearable. She missed the validation she had once received from her career, from her marriage, and from the affair with Adrian. But slowly, in the quiet moments of reflection, Catherine began to see the threads of her life differently. She sought out a therapist, not to fix herself, but to better understand why she had acted the way she did. Her therapist helped her explore the empty space that had driven her to betray her own values. Catherine realized that she had been living for the approval of others for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. Over time, Catherine rebuilt her career, not with the aim of restoring her former status, but to create something that truly mattered to her. She launched a consulting firm that focused on personal growth and empowerment, helping others navigate the complex terrain of self-worth and professional fulfillment. But the most significant transformation came when Catherine learned to truly love herself. The same woman who had once sought approval from everyone around her now stood tall in her own sense of value. She began to set boundaries in her relationships, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid to say no when something didn't align with her core values. Catherine's redemption wasn't about re-entering a relationship with Daniel or reconciling with Adrian. It was about reconnecting with the person she had once been, before the noise of life had drowned out her own voice. And in that quiet reconnection, she found peace. Chapter 3. The Unlikely Forgiveness of Daniel. Daniel had never imagined that forgiveness would be a part of his life's journey. After Catherine's affair, he had closed himself off from the possibility of love again. The pain of betrayal had consumed him, and for a long time he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been the fool in his own life story. His mind played over the same questions. How could I have been so blind? What did I miss? Was I not enough? But as the years passed, Daniel began to understand something deeper. The bitterness he held on to was keeping him trapped in a loop of hurt. It was easier to hate than to face the vulnerability of forgiveness. Revenge after betrayal. A dark journey through the heart of vengeance. Chapter 1. The seed of vengeance. Revenge is an emotion that often simmers beneath the surface after betrayal, a temptation too powerful to ignore. For some, it feels like the only way to regain control, to settle the score. The desire to see the one who wronged you pay for their actions can cloud judgment, warp intentions, and lead down a path of destruction that, once started, is nearly impossible to turn back from. Adrian Blackwell had always prided himself on being a man of control, a master of his fate. Yet, when Catherine's betrayal came crashing into his life, his carefully curated world shattered. The affair was not just an infidelity, it was an affront. To his pride, a public humiliation that stripped him of his reputation, his career, and his family. For weeks, Adrian seethed with anger, replaying the moment of discovery over and over again in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine had used him, that her affection for him had been nothing but a calculated move to fuel her own desires. He wasn't just heartbroken, he was furious, and fury, as Adrian would soon learn, could be the catalyst for something much darker. He began to plan. His thoughts were consumed with the idea of retribution. He couldn't allow Catherine to go unpunished. Her betrayal had not only cost him his marriage, but also his sense of self-worth. She had played with his emotions, used him as a pawn, and now she would face the consequences. The plan began slowly, subtle manipulations, quiet moves designed to chip away at her life. Adrian, with his connections and vast influence, knew exactly how to destroy someone quietly without raising suspicion. A well-timed rumor here, an accusation there, and soon enough Catherine's professional reputation would begin to crumble. He started to gather information, digging into her past, into the smallest of details. Every secret, every flaw, every misstep. He would exploit them all. Chapter 2. Catherine's blind spot. Catherine, meanwhile, had convinced herself that her affair with Adrian had been a moment of weakness, something to escape her own feelings of emptiness. What she hadn't expected, however, was the wrath that Adrian harbored. For weeks after the affair ended, she remained unaware of the extent to which Adrian was plotting his revenge. Her life, once so carefully constructed, began to unravel. Her business dealings, once praised for their brilliance, now seemed to be the subject of scrutiny. She lost contracts, faced internal complaints at her firm, and heard whispers of her personal life being discussed behind her back. She began to feel the weight of something sinister, but she couldn't place it. When Adrian's name appeared in her inbox, offering vague, insinuating messages under the guise of concern, she tried to dismiss it. But each message, each subtle threat, only served to deepen her anxiety. She couldn't escape the feeling that Adrian had set his sights on, destroying her, and he was succeeding. What she didn't know was that Adrian was pulling strings she hadn't even considered, creating scenarios where her every move was under a microscope, making her look untrustworthy in the eyes of her colleagues. Rumors were planted about her, competence, and even her personal integrity. Soon, she was seen as someone who couldn't be relied upon, and her reputation, so carefully built over years, was crumbling. Chapter 3. The Silent Descent into Destruction. But revenge, Adrian soon realized, was not as satisfying as he had hoped. There was no triumphant feeling of victory, no sense of justice in watching Catherine squirm. Instead, there was a gnawing emptiness that settled deep within him. The more he orchestrated her downfall, the more he felt the weight of his own actions. He had been consumed by a need for control and validation. But now that he was getting what he thought he wanted, the taste of victory was bitter, like ash in his mouth. Catherine, too, was spiraling. Her world had become a maze of paranoia and self-doubt. She couldn't trust anyone, least of all herself. She wondered if she was being punished for her past mistakes, for the affair, for betraying the man who had once been the center of her world. Her career was in free fall and her personal life was in tatters. She no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. Was she a victim of her own choices, or was she simply reaping what she had sown? Adrian, meanwhile, watched from the shadows, but as his revenge unfolded, he began to notice something unsettling. Catherine was becoming a shell of the woman he had once known. The sharpness in her eyes, the confidence in her stride. It was all fading, replaced by uncertainty and fear. It should have pleased him, but instead, it made him uncomfortable. Was this truly the victory he sought? Adrian realized too late that in seeking to destroy Catherine, he had destroyed himself. Revenge for betrayal. The Last Steps on a Destructive Path, Chapter 6. The Price of Vengeance. Adrian Blackwell stood in the empty room of what used to be his sanctuary, a once thriving office space now stripped of its luxurious furniture and polished floors. The city skyline outside the window, once a symbol of his triumphs, now seemed distant and hollow. He had achieved the vengeance he so desperately sought against Catherine, but at what cost? For weeks, he had maneuvered in the shadows, pulling invisible strings that manipulated the world around her. At first, it felt intoxicating. He had seen Catherine's career falter as the rumors he planted took root. Her relationships with colleagues began to disintegrate, her professional reputation shattered beyond repair. The affair had made her an outcast, But Adrian's calculated whispers, the sharp-edged rumors he scattered through the tight-knit corporate circles, ensured that her fall was not swift, but slow, agonizing. Every piece of her life seemed to be crumbling. Yet as Adrian watched her from afar, there was no triumphant feeling, no sense of victory. The power he thought he would gain from watching her suffer had turned into a hollow, aching emptiness. He had taken everything from her, her career, her trust in others, her self-esteem. But in doing so, he had drained himself of the very essence that had once driven him: purpose. And as Adrian's own empire crumbled, his company slowly losing its value, his associates pulling away, his name becoming synonymous with ruthlessness and betrayal, he realized that revenge, while sweet in its moment, had come with a price too steep to pay. Chapter 7. Catherine's Awakening. Meanwhile, Catherine sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of Adrian's actions finally hitting her. Her career was in tatters. What had once seemed like a promising future now felt like a distant memory. She had tried to make peace with the idea of moving on after the affair, but Adrian's quiet vengeance had left deep scars on her soul. She had no idea at first who was behind the destruction. It was only after a series of unsettling encounters, whispers from former colleagues, veiled threats, and odd circumstances at her workplace, that the truth started to dawn on her. Adrian, the man she had once loved, the man she had betrayed, was behind it all. His revenge was not just public, it was personal. The realization hit her like a sharp blade. Adrian had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the pain she had caused him, and in doing so, he had created a world where neither of them could escape the consequences of their actions. Yet, in a twisted way, Catherine felt a strange kind of liberation. Her life, once dictated by the fear of others' opinions and her need for validation, had been exposed to its rawest form. The person she had once been, the woman who had cheated, who had betrayed Adrian in search of validation, was gone. What remained was a woman stripped of pretense, forced to confront the truth of who she had become. Catherine did not seek revenge. She sought redemption. The destruction of her life, while painful, had forced her to rebuild it from the ground up. The love affair with Adrian had long since ended, but the lessons she learned from her mistakes, her desire for control, her need for affection, her inability to be honest with herself, were now shaping her future in ways she hadn't anticipated. She would never be the same, but perhaps, for the first time in her life, she was ready to start again. Chapter 8. The Echo of Broken Dreams. The days dragged on, and the lives of both Adrian and Catherine had been irrevocably changed. What was once a marriage, then an affair, had transformed into a twisted, unrecognizable battlefield where neither of them emerged unscathed. Adrian's desire for vengeance had only led him to his own personal ruin. His business dealings began to unravel as his reputation took a hit. His financial success seemed to mean nothing when his name was now linked with manipulation and treachery. There were whispers of his personal vendetta against Catherine, and those whispers began to take root in boardrooms, in offices, and in social circles. He had once been a man of integrity, but his descent into revenge had left his name tarnished forever. No amount of wealth or success could undo the damage his actions had caused. He found himself isolated, a shadow of the man he had once been. Catherine, on the other hand, had fought for her survival. The woman who had once craved attention, validation, and control was now forced to rebuild her identity. She moved into a modest apartment, far from the life she had once known. She focused on her healing, reading books on self-discovery, speaking with mentors, and attending therapy. Slowly, she began to regain control of her own narrative, learning that true empowerment came not from external validation, but from within. Chapter 10. Rebuilding from the Ashes. As the years passed, Adrian and Catherine's lives continued to evolve in different directions, though their pasts were always a shadow looming just behind them. What they had once seen as victory and defeat slowly transformed into lessons, their identities shaped by both their triumphs and their failures. Adrian had learned, perhaps too late, that true power did not lie in controlling others or in seeking revenge. It was found in self-mastery, in vulnerability, and in accepting the consequences of one's actions. He retreated from the spotlight, taking a job far from his previous world of corporate politics and ambition. The quiet hum of an office job was a stark contrast to the grandiose meetings and fast-paced life he had once known, but it gave him peace. For the first time, Adrian realized that the pursuit of power and dominance had only led him to self-destruction. He began to focus on simple pleasures: reading, writing, volunteering at local shelters. He sought to connect with others on a human level, building relationships that were not based on status or manipulation. Adrian had become a different man, one who understood that life wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption, humility, and self-discovery. Catherine, too, had found a path of healing. She had started her own business, one that reflected her values of transparency and honesty. It wasn't a venture for wealth or status, but for purpose. She wanted to create something that mattered, something that could help others avoid the mistakes she had made. Her work became a beacon of her own transformation. She built a team of individuals who shared her ideals, creating a company culture founded on trust and respect. She had learned, through bitter experience, that true success was never achieved through manipulation or self-interest. It was achieved by lifting others up, by being authentic, and by doing the right thing even when it was hard. In her personal life, Catherine also found peace. She sought therapy, spent time reconnecting with old friends, and focused on nurturing healthy relationships. For the first time in years, she could look at herself in the mirror without shame. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. Chapter 11. The Reunion. One day, years after the tumult of their past had settled into the quiet of their separate lives, Adrian and Catherine found themselves in the same room again. A mutual friend, someone from their old world, had invited them to a gathering. It was meant to be a celebration of sorts, an event filled with familiar faces and old connections, but it also carried the weight of unresolved history. When Adrian first saw Catherine from across the room, a rush of old emotions hit him: anger, regret, and a lingering, strange sense of longing. But this time, they weren't the same people. They had both changed. Catherine's gaze met his, and in that brief moment, there was no animosity, no burning desire for retribution. There was only the silent recognition of the past they shared, a past that had both scarred and shaped them. Catherine approached him slowly, her steps measured, her face calm. When she stood before him, there was no hostility, no walls. She had forgiven him long ago. But more importantly, she had forgiven herself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Adrian said quietly, his voice softer than she had remembered. "I didn't think I'd see you either," Catherine replied, her tone measured but not cold. "But life has a way of bringing people together, doesn't it?" Adrian nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. "I'm sorry for everything I did to you. I was wrong. I should never have tried to hurt you. I thought it would fix things, but it didn't. It only made everything worse." Catherine's eyes softened, though she did not immediately speak. Her past with Adrian had been painful, but she had moved beyond the need for vengeance. The woman standing before him now was not the same one who had been betrayed, nor the one who had betrayed him in return. Time had healed those wounds, even if the scars remained. "I've made my peace with everything," Catherine finally said, her voice steady. "What we had, it was toxic. But I've learned from it. I'm not who I was back then, and I hope you aren't either." Adrian looked at her, taking in her composed demeanor, the confidence that radiated from her in a way it never had before. He could tell that the years had been kind to her in the ways that mattered most. "No, I'm not the same," he admitted. "And I'm not sure I ever could be. But I'm at peace now, too." They stood in silence for a few moments, neither of them knowing exactly what to say next. It wasn't the resolution of a story they had expected, nor the closure they had once imagined. There were no grand gestures of forgiveness, no dramatic confessions. Chapter 13. New Paths, Shared Journeys. As the years continued to pass, both Adrian and Catherine's lives unfolded in ways they had never expected. The scars of their shared past, once raw and overwhelming, had begun to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and growth. Though their lives no longer intersected in the same dramatic way, they found themselves influenced by the choices they had made and the changes they had embraced. Their healing was not just personal, it was universal, shaping the lives of others in ways neither of them could have predicted. Adrian's transformation. A quiet legacy. Adrian had become a man of contemplation and service, one who sought to leave behind a legacy that was not tainted by vengeance or power. His days of boardrooms and high-stakes business deals were long gone. Instead, he focused on the local community, working with nonprofits dedicated to helping people who had lost everything, just as he had once felt he'd lost everything. He had taken to speaking at conferences about overcoming betrayal, not from a place of superiority, but from one of shared experience. He often spoke of his mistakes, of the ways in which revenge had only led him further into darkness. His honesty became his strength, and it drew people to him. Those who once saw him as ruthless now saw him as a guide. A man who had been to the lowest depths and was willing to show others how to rise again. Adrian's new sense of peace came from giving, from sharing what he had learned with others, who were struggling with their own demons. It wasn't a path to redemption in the way he had once imagined it. There was no grand moment of absolution, but a quiet, steady life of purpose. He spent time in the places where others needed him, listening to their stories and offering what help he could. In a way, this service to others was the only form of atonement he could give. Catherine's rise. Empowerment through empathy. Catherine, too, had embraced a different path. Her business, which had started small with a focus on ethical practices and employee well-being, had grown into a respected company known for its commitment to transparency, integrity, and social responsibility. She used her platform to mentor others, especially young women who had faced the pressures of success at any cost. Her journey had taught her that true leadership was not about being at the top, but about lifting others up along the way. She found herself frequently invited to speak at conferences, her words resonating with those who had struggled with their own failures and betrayals. Her message was clear. Failure was not the end, but a beginning. Every misstep, every moment of weakness had been a stepping stone toward the woman she had become, a woman who understood the value of empathy, authenticity, and self-love. Her business became a force for change, not just in the marketplace, but in the lives of the people it touched. She implemented programs to support employees during difficult times, offering counseling, mentorship, and financial support. The company became known for its human-first approach, something Catherine was deeply proud of. Beyond her professional success, Catherine also found personal fulfillment. She reconnected with her family, mending relationships that had once been strained. She traveled, learned new languages, and even wrote a book about her experiences, using her story to inspire others to overcome betrayal and rebuild their lives. The unexpected meeting. A moment of reflection. Years after their initial awkward reunion, Adrian and Catherine crossed paths again, though this time it wasn't at a celebration or event. It was a simple encounter in a quiet cafe, both of them sitting alone, each lost in their thoughts. Adrian, still as reserved as ever, looked up to find Catherine standing near the counter, her presence still as commanding as it had been in the past. This time, there was no tension, no unresolved history between them. There was simply the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had shared a moment in time, whose lives had since taken separate but equally transformative paths. Catherine approached, a soft smile on her face. "I didn't expect to run into you. Here," she said, her voice calm and unguarded. Adrian looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't expect it either." They sat together, as if the years of distance had been nothing more than a fleeting moment. They talked not about the past, but about the present, the changes they had made, the lessons they had learned, and the lives they had built. Their conversation was easy, no longer burdened by the weight of their shared history. They spoke of the future, of what they hoped to see in the world, and the ways in which they were working toward making it a better place. For the first time, there was no bitterness in their exchange, no resentment, just two people who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but wiser. Chapter 14. The Shadows Return. Years had passed since Adrian and Catherine had walked separate, healing paths, but the scars of their shared past never fully faded. Life had moved forward, but both knew the lingering weight of betrayal could resurface at any time, like a storm waiting to break. Neither expected that it would return in the form of a new chapter in Catherine's life, one that would test everything she had worked to overcome. The new beginning. Catherine's business had flourished, and she had found a steady rhythm in her life, one that no longer included Adrian, nor the toxic relationship they had once shared. Her personal life, too, was in a place of quiet peace. She had remarried, this time to a man named Edward. Edward was kind, patient, and loving, everything she had once thought impossible to find again. They had built a life together, one rooted in mutual respect and understanding. For a time, it seemed like Catherine had finally found the happiness she had once lost. But life, as it often does, had a way of reminding her that the past could sometimes be more present than we realize. Catherine began noticing subtle changes in Edward's behavior. Late nights at work, unexplained absences, the glint of suspicion in his eyes when he came home. At first, she dismissed it, convincing herself that work was stressful and that he simply needed space. But then came the text message. It was a late night, and Catherine had stayed up, reflecting on the day's events. Her phone buzzed, and when she glanced at the screen, her heart dropped. It was a message from an unknown number, containing nothing but a single image. It was a photo of Edward, standing too close to another woman, his hand resting on her lower, back in a way that seemed too intimate for a business meeting. The room seemed to spin as Catherine stared at the photo, her breath catching in her throat. She had felt this before, this sickening knot in her stomach, this familiar feeling of betrayal. The weight of it bore down on her chest. Her first instinct was to call Edward, to confront him, but something held her back. She needed to know more. The investigation, Catherine's instincts were sharp, and she knew better than to let emotions cloud her judgment. She took a step back, watching closely, gathering more evidence without drawing attention to herself. Over the next few days, her suspicions deepened. Edward's behavior became more erratic, more secretive. His phone, once left unattended, now seemed to be constantly within his grasp. The quiet dinners they once shared had become filled with excuses, distractions, and tension. Catherine's mind raced. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to move beyond the mistakes of her past, only to find herself in a similar situation once again. She had learned from her previous marriage that confronting the situation without clarity would only lead to more pain, so she bided her time. In her quiet moments, Catherine would sometimes reflect on Adrian's words from the past, how revenge was a poison, how it would only poison her as well. She had vowed never to let herself be consumed by bitterness again, but the temptation to confront Edward, to expose his lies, began to burn inside her. Her anger was not just toward him, but toward herself for trusting again. The confrontation. One evening, after several weeks of careful observation, Catherine confronted Edward. She had gathered everything: photos, texts, and evidence of his betrayal. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Edward was at home, sitting on the couch, his phone in his hands. Catherine approached him quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady, though a wave of emotion surged within her. Edward looked up, his eyes betraying a flicker of guilt. "What's going on?" he asked, though the nervousness in his tone was unmistakable. Catherine held up the phone with the photo. "Is this how you've been spending your time? With her?" She didn't need to say more. The image was clear, damning, and unambiguous. Edward's face drained of color. He had been caught, and there was no escaping the truth. "Catherine, he stammered, but she cut him off. "You've been lying to me for months. I trusted you, Edward. I gave you everything, and this is what you do? You've betrayed me." Her voice wavered, but her words were sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Edward stood up, his hands outstretched in defense. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't planned. It's just that it doesn't matter," Catherine interjected, her eyes burning with the fury of someone who had been wronged yet again. "I gave you a second chance. I trusted you, and you've thrown it all away for what? A moment of weakness?" Edward lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know what came over me. It's not what I want, I swear." "But it is what you did," Catherine replied, cold. Chapter 15. Edward's regret and the cost of betrayal. After Catherine left, Edward found himself in the aftermath of his own poor decisions, grappling with the consequences of his betrayal. The lavish life he had once taken for granted felt cold and empty now. The things that had once given him joy, his career, his success, the superficial admiration of colleagues, lost their luster in the absence of Catherine's presence. She had been the anchor of his life, the one who kept him grounded, and now she was gone. The weight of his choices. Edward spent many sleepless nights alone in their once shared home, staring out at the city lights, feeling the coldness of his actions seep deep into his bones. It wasn't just the loss of Catherine that he mourned. It was the understanding that he had thrown away something irreplaceable for a fleeting moment of selfishness. His affair had started innocently enough, a work colleague who admired his ambition, who complimented him when others did not. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred, and he had lost sight of what truly mattered. As time passed, the remorse gnawed at him. He tried reaching out to Catherine, sending her texts, emails, and calling her more times than he could count, each time hoping for a response. But each attempt was met with silence. It was as though she had vanished from his life, taking all, the warmth, with her. He could feel her absence like a physical wound, a constant reminder of how deeply he had wounded her. A moment of clarity. One evening, while sitting alone at a bar, Edward ran into someone from his past, a mutual acquaintance from his and Catherine's earlier years together. The man, Paul, recognized Edward immediately and took a seat next to him. They exchanged pleasantries, but there was an awkwardness between them. The usual camaraderie was absent. Edward, lost in his thoughts, didn't even attempt to mask the sadness on his face. "You look like a man who's lost something," Paul remarked after a few moments of silence. Edward chuckled bitterly. "You could say that," he replied, taking another sip of his drink. "I lost everything that mattered. Everything I thought I had. Gone." Paul raised an eyebrow, looking at him with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. "Catherine?" Edward nodded. "She left. I don't blame her. I was a fool." Paul was silent for a long moment, then spoke, his voice low and steady. "You know, I've seen this happen before. Men who think they can have it all. They think they can juggle everything, that they're untouchable, but eventually it catches up with them. And when it does, there's no going back." Edward felt a heavy weight settle in his chest, the words hitting harder than he expected. "I don't know how to fix it," he muttered. "I've tried everything. I've apologized, but it feels like she doesn't even care anymore, like she's moved on for good." Paul glanced at him, his eyes reflecting a kind of understanding. "There's no easy answer, Edward. Sometimes the damage you've done is too much to repair. But there's one thing you can do. Acknowledge the cost. Take responsibility for it. Stop blaming her for your mistakes. That's the first step." Edward sat back in his seat, the weight of Paul's words sinking in. Responsibility. The idea was simple, yet profoundly difficult. He had never truly taken responsibility for his actions. He had always been quick to point the finger at others, at circumstances, at fate. But the truth was, he had made a choice, and that choice had irrevocably changed the course of his life. Seeking redemption. The days that followed were filled with reflection. Edward stopped chasing after Catherine, stopped making excuses. He knew that no amount of grand gestures or apologies would undo the hurt he had caused. Instead, he began to look inward, examining the patterns of his own behavior that had led him down this path of destruction. He sought out therapy, something he had never considered before, and began to unravel the layers of insecurity, fear, and ambition that had driven him to cheat. He wasn't doing it to win Catherine back. That ship had sailed, but to understand himself better, to heal from within. It was in therapy that Edward learned a hard truth. He had been emotionally unavailable for years, even before the affair. His need for validation, his constant striving for success, had all been a way to avoid confronting the emptiness he felt inside. In the affair, he had thought he had found a quick fix, a distraction from his own inadequacies. But now, as he sat in that sterile room facing his own flaws and weaknesses, he realized just how much he had betrayed himself in the process. Catherine's new life. Meanwhile, Catherine had begun to heal as well, though in her own way. She focused on herself, on her growth, her business, and her family. The pain of Edward's betrayal had softened into a quiet resolve.